Okay. Well, for everyone, today we have a special treat. Not only do we have the one and only Liz Pelly here to talk about her incredible book, Mood Machine: The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist, which is out now. And, like, if you haven't read it yet, where are you? What are you doing? But also, we have joining us back out of retirement in for one last big score, the one, the only Mr. Penny Fractions himself, David Turner.
It's good to be back. It's good to be back. Two wonderful people here.
And we're here in kind of like a semi-valedictory mode, I feel like, because like I said already, one of our own, Liz, has just like taken the good gospel out into the broader world. Listen to my, I can't look at a podcast feed or kind of like alt left ish magazine without seeing a review or an explicit interview with this incredible book. And just like, it's so exciting to see so many people being pumped about a critical engagement with music and technology and the story of what's happened to music over the past 10 or 15 years in this really like feeling like energized way, which like in this year of our Lord 2025 there aren't many like good bright spot energizing conversations happening, and I feel like this book is one of them. Liz, we're so glad to have you here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I think that one of the things I was hoping writing the book was that in addition to taking some of the writing that I've been doing over the years and trying to maybe present it in a way that would be more accessible to a more generalist audience. But I also was thinking a lot about like the ways in which the book could point back to the work of other writers and critics and researchers who have been doing work around this subject for years, like really good work. And hopefully, for the very engaged and curious reader, it would also kind of provide, a map of where to go next too. So this is great. I'd hope that anyone who's interested in Mood Machine would also, yeah, check out David's archive of work and check out Money for Nothing.
And like a murderer's row of like other good books are in the book. It's like computing taste. It's like all of the. It's really like a, like you said, I think a map of all of these folks working in this space, thinking critically about these questions.
Mhm. Yeah, because there's been so much good work, critical engagement with the intersection of music and technology for a really long time. And I think in some ways the task is just like trying to figure out how to make it accessible to a broader readership, or even just kind of like providing a more visible entry point.
Yeah. So I wanna, one of the things I like most about this book, is that I think it does like a, it's like genuinely a masterclass in how to both, how to write about technology in a way that both thinks about the technology and what it's doing and what it can be doing in new ways, and also puts that technology in a, it's very specific context, that it's not like the technology doing something, it's like the technology used by these people for this reason in this year, given this kind of like these set of cultural coordinates in which they're operating, create like this kind of thing in the world. I think you put it way more succinctly than I just did, when you say that this is kind of a story that's equally about what stays the same as to what Spotify has changed. So I thought maybe to start with, like, you could tell us a little bit about like how, why you think that angle is so important and how you got to it.
Yeah, I think that that definitely is kind of one of the things that has come up a lot in conversations because people always want to ask this question of like, okay, well, you're writing about the ways that streaming is changing music, but hasn't it always been like XYZ? And I think part of what's interesting is to point out that, yeah, a lot of the industry practices that are being discussed are not completely new, but there was a moment in the mid 2010s where streaming actually was pitched as a new way of thinking about music distribution. You got these early narratives of leveling the playing field, democratizing music. And I think at first, when first writing about this, something that was really interesting was sort of puncturing that narrative a bit and just trying to point out that, no, these technologies are not leveling the playing field. This is kind of like a mythology, and actually, what's being upheld are similar power structures that have always dictated the winners and losers of music culture. So yeah, there's all different types of historical contexts that end up being woven into the book, whether it be the history of mood music or the idea of technology companies selling mood stabilization as this promise in order to introduce new types of technology, or pointing out that passive listening is not this thing that streaming services invented, but there's a broader history of the lean back listener that this kind of is a new manifestation of. And then, of course, all of the ways in which artists have historically been exploited by record labels.
Yeah, no, and it does it is kind of both. I feel like what was great is that you don't necessarily like pick one of those lanes. I feel like the book just consistently flips between them. Like this is possible because of this technology, but also this is similar to, payola on Spotify, similar to payola on radio, for example, or incredible, nearly artistic levels of contractual opacity being like the rule now, but also like the rule in
Mhm.
the 60s.
And it is interesting trying to find these like moments of like what actually is new. And I do think that there are some things like the sheer level of data collection, the way in which surveillance has been integrated into daily listening practices for a lot of people. Obviously, like, surveillance in music also predates the streaming era, but the way in which people's listening is shaped by the sort of uh, daily influence of data collection, the way music creation and artists are sort of confronted by like drowning in so much data, like I think is one thing that you could look at and ask, well, maybe this actually is new.
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about this time, I go back to, so I was working at Track Record at the time, which Track Record was a music site that kind of never launched for Gizmodo Media Group, which is out of the former Gawker sites. And so because of that, it was one of those I almost like a 3 and D, but it's just like one of those blogs where like you had to write like 3 or 4 blogs a day, and but also kind of do reporting. And so that's what I would like do a lot of stories about Spotify playlists and start looking at sort of like, wait, why are the major labels dominating these playlists if they're supposed to be like new and different? And I think that's something that like I only really got to do for like 9 or so months when I worked there. But that's also when I started my newsletter at the exact same time. So a lot of that sort of ethos got to sort of carry through. And I think, Liz, that's something when you were talking about sort of the data collection, I think that's one of the interesting things to me that happened over time was like I was just kind of looking at a lot of this stuff just sort of from a like labels to control everything kind of view. But then there were like other avenues and paths that as you and others started doing more like reporting, where I was like, oh yeah, there are other things about this company and Spotify and like the streaming model overall that I wasn't even sort of picking up on at that
Yeah,
initial
I mean the
time.
labels control everything part. One of the things that blew my mind in this book, like, is the pirate stuff. Like the sense that like Spotify is actually not born out of labels controlling everything and like forcing things to happen. It's controlled out of them being like, shit, we've got like no control over what's happening in Sweden. Like, who knows?
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because I feel like even like, to date, you wonder like who really holds the power in the music business, I think is a question that still gets asked. Like, um, is it Universal Music Group or is it Spotify? Like, it's probably one of those two companies, but which one, which one is it? And the early history is certainly really interesting to go back to and realize that, oh yeah, by the time that Spotify came along, the major labels had tried to launch their own streaming services and they were really bad at it. Like they couldn't figure out how to get anyone to sign up for a streaming service. But it does seem like they had sort of in some ways committed to this idea that this was going to be the future. They just weren't actually able to make it happen. By the time Daniel Ek and Martin Lawrenson and Clive Davis's son came along to like major label digital marketing team meetings with their PowerPoint about Spotify, the labels had already for quite a while been trying to figure out like how they were going to segue into a subscription era. And in some ways, I think that kind of like worked to their benefit.
And why? I mean, that's a question I had just occurred to me. Like, why? Like, the iTunes store is already up and running to a certain extent. Like, why were they like the celestial jukebox streaming subscription service? Like, this is the way to go, because they seem to jump in with both feet. And I mean, you could imagine a slightly different model of Spotify where you get to listen. Like, you can imagine it on like a band campy model. Like, you can stream any song up to 3 times, but then to keep listening to it more, you have to buy it, right? Like something like remember iTunes used to have the preview where you could like preview 30 seconds of a song. Like, you could have said
Oh
like, we're
yeah.
gonna keep selling music. What? But it seems like the idea of like frictionless, any kind of music you could possibly listen to for one low price kind of like carried like just one in a kind of, thinking back to it, kind of surprising way.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, it is really interesting to think about that moment and to look at models that were being pitched by other services. Like, I think there were services that were trying to
Mm-hmm.
introduce ideas closer to that, or at least ideas for platforms where you could both stream and buy music. I think looking back on the history of Spotify, at least, it seems pretty clear that there was this idea that in a place like Sweden, at least, beyond probably as well, there was this type of consumer that they were trying to appeal to, which is someone who had become really accustomed to the experience of listening to digital music in a post file sharing moment, like, okay, consumers want to be able to open their laptops and hit play on quote unquote like any song in the world. Labels want to figure out how to make money off of them. And Spotify, in some ways, I feel like offered a product that like basically allowed people to just like keep having the same experience while returning money to Universal, Sony, and Warner and keeping them like happy with the whole arrangement. I do think that the free tier, it's really interesting to kind of like
Mm-hmm.
interrogate the free tier, because in some ways I think that is like kind of what set this one company apart from other models that were being like pitched and experimented with at the time. And if you listen to what people who were working in the music business at the time and people from Sweden were saying, it's that the free tier could only sort of like be piloted in a place like Sweden because they had started to see Sweden as a lost market, because piracy was not only more rampant there but politicized in a different way. And it was everyone in Sweden was like looking for something that was going to come along and provide a solution. Not just the music business, but like politicians. There's a pirate party in Sweden. There was, I mean, one of the most fascinating parts of the book was talking to people from the Pirate Bay, not just the Pirate Bay, but Pirat Baron, which this is like pro-piracy lobbying group essentially that was formed in Stockholm in those years to provide a counterweight to anti-Pirat Baron, which is the Hollywood aligned anti-piracy lobbying group. The fact that like there was enough momentum that this group of like punks and hackers could be like, well, if you're the anti-piracy lobbying group, we're a lobbying group too, but we're the pro-piracy lobbying group, is like, that's so interesting. That's like endlessly fascinating to me.
It's what I do want to like. I'm just like thinking back. This is the we were talking before we started recording. Like, one of the crazy things. I don't know if you had this experience too, David. Of like this book, like in a way that's both really exciting and like makes me deeply uncomfortable, historicizes my own listening experience in a way that nothing I've ever read has. And this part of the book, what you just said, is making me think back to like that 2012 moment. And I may, this is like this is not actually a way to make an argument because it's so based on like anecdote, but I'm just like thinking about, as someone who was like very much into downloading illegal music via like my college's like local network, all the people I knew, like they had like they hard drives, and you'd be excited about how much music you had, and there was this like collecting impulse, and it was kind of like a collector's who could just all of a sudden like kids in a candy store. And it feels like in a weird way that move to streaming, where I just like put those hard drives away in a box and like have almost never opened them again. It like it's a very different like the pleasure of streaming is very different than that earlier moment, but it feels like it happened like across culture writ large. Like this is the same moment that everyone gave away their DVDs. They had spent 15, 20 years buying libraries of Criterion Collective Collection DVDs, and then in like 3 years you'd see them, right? These huge stacks of DVDs that people were just like giving away. It felt like this broader weird moment. And it does, yeah. What you said about the kind of cultural, like technological solutionism feels like part of it. They were like, this is the next step. The internet is everything, and we can solve these problems. Maybe, I don't know. It just feels like it was a big change that somehow people at the time just kind of like went with.
This is a small note, but I'm gonna say, Sam, I do think one of the things, like when you're describing DVDs, I'm just sort of imagining, I guess, being in Brooklyn where people just throw out their DVDs and CDs, just put them on steps, and you're just like, oh, well, this is one. To your point, those like whole collections that may have been like worth like a decent amount of money at one point, but are basically like worth nothing because they're just going out onto the street. And yeah, I do think that is like something, just I guess, yeah, having like living through this in this exact moment is like a little interesting to kind of sort of feel and kind of notice. And yeah, and I guess that's always sort of the trope people sort of make about the fact of music being sort of an early progenitor to a lot of this. But I also like, I guess I wanted to just go back for 1 second and also just mention YouTube. And when we mentioned the free model, because I do feel like I do sometimes feel like when our like histories of streaming, sometimes YouTube gets kind of a little forgotten. But I guess because of, again, to store sites for myself, I think I first got on YouTube when I was like 14, like 14 or 15. So like in my mind, YouTube and music are just so intertwined. And so when people talk about Spotify, I'm always like, yeah, but like, I remember seeing a kid in college play a YouTube video off his phone my freshman year, and that was in 2010. So I was like, oh, well, I've lived in the Spotify world at least since then. So sorry, yeah, I just wanted to make that a couple little points.
No, that's a great point. That there is this broader set of like streaming like cultural practices, but that and Liz, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that early on YouTube's the Wild West in terms of music rights for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I think in some ways sort of still is, I think that there's a lot of disagreement that comes up between different advocates and musicians around reforming streaming is rooted in, different opinions about how you deal with YouTube or how you approach YouTube or conceptualize it. So that's, yeah, definitely like an important piece of the puzzle as well. It's interesting. I mean, YouTube actually is like a big part of my the puzzle of how I listen to music, but I listen to a lot. Like I have this really, maybe this is like a tangent, but for me, like I love watching like full live sets on YouTube and just having that going like in the corner while I'm like doing something else, just like pulling up like a video of a live set of like a band playing at a show to like 10 people that like just ended up on YouTube somehow, and just like having that going in the background. Love that.
Oh, interesting. I do that too, except I don't like it when I can see them. So I search like
Mm,
live bootlegs because I want to see like a fake
mhm.
album cover, but like I don't like it when there's a video attached. I don't know why, but like and this maybe kind of goes back actually to the YouTube point, because one of the things I think that is like fascinating about the book, or rather about like your discussion of the specificity of Spotify as like an aesthetic and an aesthetic marketplace and like as a shaping force in music culture is like the frictionlessness of Spotify. And it's something that I had thought about. I think people have discussed a lot in terms of playlists and mood playlists, but you really explicitly, I think, make that connection back to the very beginning of the app. That one of the things that made Spotify different than other like clunky music streaming services and also different than YouTube is that it was like, and I remember when I first saw it, it's like it's really fast. It's like better than Groove Shark. um and it, yeah, and smooth. And it was just really interesting that focus on like smoothness and lack of friction is there from the jump.
Hmm. Yeah, and I feel like, this has been coming up so much too, is like, I'm like pro universal access to music, definitely not like someone who thinks that music should be locked up behind a paywall and only accessible to people who can afford to spend money on it. But in some ways, I feel like it's the thing that has had more, in my opinion, like disastrous implications for culture has been the championing of this sort of convenience culture around frictionlessness and optimization, and not just passive listening, but also sort of like, something that I sort of trace in the book is this history of senior music programming executives being in pursuit of making the app more like a play button, where you open the app and there's just one button that you press and you get the perfect recommendation at the perfect moment, whether it be through a curated playlist or through the collection of data on your listening behavior. Self-driving music is what it was called when Spotify went public on the stock exchange in 2018, in their like investor day speech or whatever. It's kind of like more this sort of pursuit of just streamlining the experience of being a music fan. And I think that a lot of this is kind of like coming to a head right now in the conversation around like AI and this idea that like, people don't want to think, they don't want to engage in like the aspects of cultural production that involve more involvement and participation. Like when I hear the CEO of Suno being like, people don't like making music, they don't want to learn instruments, it takes a lot of time, they don't want, like, it's a really unenjoyable for people to be involved in the process of making music. To me, it's just like an extension of this cultural logic that is like, people don't want to think, like, let's just provide them the path of least resistance, let's just provide them like a really frictionless way to generate audio content that like is fine enough. I kind of think that I think of them as all sort of like connected in some ways. And I think as critics and also people who care about music, it's like really important to push back on it. Like in my book, there's this one former Spotify employee I talked to who describes the big picture goals of the curation systems on streaming services, as trying to reduce the cognitive work that listeners have to do, which is a really fancy way of saying to help people not have to think. And I think that think like I keep saying this and it sounds so funny. Like I think that thinking is important is like such a funny sentence, but I'm like, but yes, like let's think about
No, I
music.
fully agree. I mean, I think that's one of the things about streaming that I always kind of disliked is the lack of context. And I think that's like a broad thing that across streaming platforms, be it music, television, movies, like most media, is that like there's just such lack of context for things. And I think like or I guess like from my perspective, and I think over time what I've seen, especially reading younger music writers, is that folks are just bringing whole new context to music and to experiences of music in this fully digitized form that like some of it makes sense to me, some of it doesn't. But I think that's like something with streaming that I often kind of think about is like the lack of context and invest. And I guess also coming from the background of being a former music critic, it's like, oh, I just when music comes out now, it's like, oh, it's just all on Spotify and it's sort of a dump. And it's like, okay, well, like, how am I supposed to differentiate this dump of content? Like, I was listening to like Bad Bunny's like latest album, like I guess earlier this week, last week, and it's like good, but it just always feel like music kind of goes through my fingers, and I do think that smoothness you're talking about is even something I think when I first used Spotify in college, like so like 2011, 2012, it was like, oh yeah, this feels really smooth, which was a good experience. But I could kind of feel something a little bit lost even at that point of just compared to finding an MP3 on a blog or like again buying a CD or like whatever.
I'm I mean, though, to push back a little bit, I mean, like, I do think I
Mhm.
agree with you about the smoothness, but what you're saying about the lack of context makes me really think again about like Spotify versus something like YouTube, right? Because I remember like when I was first started writing for Afropop Worldwide, there was this moment I remember where I'm like, there's just mixtapes, there's endless mixtapes, endless mixes from DJs on SoundCloud and various places, and I'm like, I'm actually not going back to anything. Like everything I'm listening to for the
Yeah.
first and the last time today. And occasionally I try to save stuff, but even then I wouldn't go back to it because it either saved too much or too little, and I never solved the problem, like the curatorial problem. And like that is like one set of issues I think that emerge from digitized music, maybe generally. But like those playlists had or those mixtapes had context. Like they came from blogs, they came from things. And again, I'm just thinking like maybe for for the first time about like the one of the funny things is even like forget the it would be great if they had liner notes, which like they could do and have like explicitly chosen not to have liner notes, not to have musicians, not to have anything that could allow you like it is not impossible for me to like listen to a disco track, click on the drummer and see everything else that he played on. Like all that information is out there, but like we've got large language models, so we can do it, and they've chosen not to. But even like explicitly thinking about YouTube, not to have comments, because when I open a YouTube video, like the
Yes.
comment
Yes.
conversation is a cultural context.
I mean, I think of that with YouTube quite a lot because a lot of YouTube comments, I mean, I guess I just gravitate to the ones on songs where it's like people are like, "Oh, wow, I've never been more happy." Or this song always reminds me of my dad, and they're just like really sad. Like they're very like base, and I always like really appreciate that about those. But yeah, like on Spotify or actually all streaming platforms, you get none of that. And actually, Sam, what you were just saying about the large language models like provide us that stuff, that additional sort of like liner notes as content. It's like funny, I think, because I'm like, I've used Tidal, I think, once or twice. And even then, that's like one of their selling points. And even that, they don't even try to like make it compelling or make it kind of something that you want to engage with, even though it could be something that could be actually really like rewarding and exciting to use within the app
I'm
experience.
laughing because last night I was listening to some music on YouTube that I really liked in high school, and the comments on like every song are just listening in 2025. And I
The
and
Oh
best.
I
The
no.
was
best.
I've been thinking I actually like last night like had this moment of just like reflecting on like the comment listening in 2025 and like what it means. And I'm like it actually like it is like kind of meaningful in some way to just like be listening to this song that like I thought like it's like nobody remembers these bands and like
Can you spill like
oh,
what?
it was literally like not interesting stuff. Like literally like horrible emo bands that were on major labels. That like, I don't even remember why I was listening to this. But it's like, listening in 2025. And I'm like, this is so funny. Like it's not, people are listening to this in 2025. Anyway, sorry. But yeah, that is context, I guess.
I mean, it's something. It's some grounding to
It's
other people.
something.
It's definitely something.
Like
It's
it's
something.
not just you listening to this. It's other people listening in 2025 like you are also listening in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have, talked so much about kind of like the alienation and atomization of the streaming listener, and it is like you said, like, it's an intentional decision. Like, streaming services like decided to make streaming a frictionless experience, and part of that frictionlessness is also making it a really isolating experience also.
Yeah, no, I know. I mean, and there was that moment when they play. I mean, well, that's another thing that's amazing, and I'd love to hear like everyone's thoughts on this. That like because you have this detailed history of Spotify kind of running through this, so like running through the whole book and also behind you. Like you reminded me how many goofy one-off like new directions they've tried over the last decade or so. Um,
Car
and
thing.
And I didn't even talk about car
Car
thing. That's not even
thing,
in the book. Car thing's not even in the book.
R.I.P. Car thing.
Yeah.
We never knew what you were. Uh, no, but like there was that moment when there was the integration with Facebook. And like there were that moments where you could like send each other musical messages. And like there was this whole set of and the video and the side videos and like there's a million things. And one of the things that's fascinating is like I had always seen that as like this flailing desperate company and that's why they were trying to do so many things. But it also feels like it's like that not giving a fuck about anything in particular is like reflected in constantly trying things and like is actually like way more of a through line of like how they deal with the world than I expected it to
Mhm.
be.
Yeah, it's just like, to use their internal logic, it's just like the bets and they just make bets on things and if number goes up, this becomes part of the company and if the number goes down, this stops being part of the strategy.
And in doing that, they're like shaping an entire aesthetic universe for
Yeah.
all of music.
Well, that's the other thing too. I had this really interesting conversation with one former Spotify employee that is in the book, and it's something that kind of stuck with me, where this person was like, there's things that over the years you've like written about, and I just like, think you should understand that like to you things might seem like they're like these nefarious kind of like bad faith like decisions that are being made, but in a lot of situations it's just someone's job was tasked they were tasked with moving a metric and their job is just figuring out how to move a metric and in some ways I feel like I that's quoted in the book because it's true. It's like a lot of times the person's literal job is making this one metric go up, but like you have to also consider the consequences on culture that your job was making this metric go up with little regard for the long-term effects of it, you know when you have a whole company of just people trying to make the metrics go up, like at what point is it reshaping music and culture?
I'm
or
gonna say
like
this
yeah.
reminds me of when I worked at SoundCloud, I always like one of my first bosses would always talk about the skip rate of songs, which I think definitely comes from Spotify, like skip rate. And I always just sort of like, well, that's like an entirely fake stat that means absolutely nothing. Why do I care about this? Like I never said that explicitly, but like that was kind of always at the top of my head because it was like the way to say, oh, well, it's a good song. People aren't skipping it. It means in the playlist, blah, blah, blah. And I was just always like, but like people skip songs for we have no idea like why people are skipping songs. I feel like I've read and I mean at that point I probably hadn't read as much, but now I definitely have read enough research about streaming and music listening to know like we don't have that. We don't really know what that means. Maybe Spotify internally has that information. I'm sure of any companies, I'm sure they do. But like interpreting that data to me is kind of like it's already very skewed of the direction folks want to sort of take that information. And so I guess I say this because I was just sort of thinking, reflecting a bit, as you were saying, Liz, about my time at SoundCloud and being when I was on the product team there. And one of the things that I saw was the like flailing around, being like, we got to do a TikTok thing. Oh, wait, no, we got to try to do playlists more like Spotify. We got to, it's just like this like constant sort of like whipsawing from like one kind of
Right.
priority to another. Some of that has to do with like internal instability, where it's like, oh, this person was the head of this team. They're only there for like 9 months. Now they're gone. Projects get caught in limbo. And like all these sort of like machinations, which I think maybe to like give like a little like more like an also a positive spin to that Spotify employee, or like maybe reflecting what I sort of see in that quote is like, yeah, like a lot of these things that we see on the outside on the inside, you're like, oh yeah, like this is a product that like no one really believed in, and it's just kind of a thing that is now getting over the finish line. But like a third of the team that started it are no longer here, and the rest that are still working on the project are just like ready to go on to the next thing. But it still had this huge weight on the world and culture, but like that's sort of like the conditions that end up making up some of these things.
Yeah. I mean that question, I mean, I feel like it is an open, I mean, maybe not to you, Liz, you might actually know, and so I'm gonna ask you. But like I feel like with a lot of the Spotify stuff, The thing I still like don't understand, like at a really deep level, is whether any of it is real. like clearly like they can change metrics, they can change things, they can push stuff to try to get people to listen more. I mean, A, like it is. I mean, maybe not. Is that A, is that real? And then B, like there's like feels like the entire value proposition at some level of the company is about that. Like they can understand that final gap to like how people are actually engaging with music, and like I didn't know before I read the book, and I'm like I feel like they can't, but I don't know. Like do they can do they think they can? Do they care?
Like, do they think they can change the way that people listen?
Yeah, not maybe like not maybe just like can they change the way people act on Spotify, but can they change the way people actually engage with
Mm.
music?
Well, that's interesting, because talking to some of the former employees about how, they would have, for example, like a goal to like make changes in the interface to like shift consumption over to like a certain piece of the visual real estate. Like, there's this one really interesting passage where I talked to a former employee about how at a certain point there was this bigger strategic project to shift consumption to the homepage so that people would be doing like less searching, less reliance on library. And this was like, during the time when the company was moving more towards kind of a hyper personalized sort of like TikTok for you page type front page, to try to have, the way this person described it, the goal was trying to move people to the homepage so that more of the consumption was coming through a fully programmed interface so that they could just have this one central place people could go to get the
Yeah.
perfect recommendation every time, based on their listening behavior. So I guess, like in a situation like that, I do think it's as interesting to like know the aspirations, to know like the internal strategizing, as it is to know like, well, did that actually work? Like, did they successfully move people's consumption to the homepage? Uh, yeah, like, good question. I think that like the most recent stat is that like they say like a third of the music that people they still say that about a third of the music that people listen to, or a third of discoveries, come from their own programming. So, is that a lot? Also a question. I mean, I think it's a lot. I think that like uh I think a third of listening being dictated by personalization products is a lot. Or maybe not dictated, shaped is a better way of saying it, shaped or influenced. Trying really hard, one of the things that I really learned from the one of the things I really learned from academics is the importance of like using words like shaped and influenced instead of dictate or determined. So thank you guys. Not you guys, just the general you guys.
Wait, when you say personalization products, and that gets to like a really key change when a chunk of this book's about playlisting and kind of like the moments of playlisting. We already talked a little bit, David. You were talking about kind of like the Wild West era when it's like, why are they all major label tracks on Rap Caviar? Uh, but there is this move. It feels like from curatorial to like algorithmically generated, like for like supposedly like get not supposedly algorithmically generated, like individualized. So when you say a third of the listening is that a third of the listening is like people going to like chill as fuck coffee house beats, or or is it like chill as fuck coffee house beats for David Turner?
That's actually a good question. I would want to like pull up the press release in which they talk about it. I think that they say like a third of discoveries happen like through their recommendations. So I would assume that they're talking about the whole programming ecosystem of curated playlists and personalized recommendations. So like all of it together. So like, the programming strategy, like the music that they're putting in front of you through all of the different ways in which they have figured out how to do that, which would encompass like curated playlists, algotorial playlists, and their personalization products. Um, but yeah, it was super interesting. I mean, like one thing I tried to do while I was working on the book was like look through the I looked through like uh a the number of time that I spent reading like the Spotify blog and like the ways in which Spotify is like characterizing itself in a public facing way. Like um yeah, I hope that there aren't many other people who would subject themselves to this much time spent doing this because
For
it's like super
science.
boring. But I was trying to figure out like if there was a moment when they shifted from talking about algorithmic recommendations as a means of discovery towards I noticed that at a certain point all of these personalized playlists started being um, framed in the context of made for you, and I was thinking about how like made for you is really different. And I actually, so the exact moment was I realized I was like looking through the browse page and I realized that it was really easy to find things that said made for you, but I think I was trying to in like 2023 I was trying to find Discover Weekly and I was like, oh, they actually made it like kind of hard to find Discover Weekly and Release Radar. Like I have to do a lot of digging to find the playlists that happen under the banner of Discover, which used to be a much bigger part of the product. Like the Discover page was a bigger deal. This was like um uh a lot of like the sort of like Echo Nest influence, I think, on like this idea of Discover. And sort of differentiating between this idea of Discover, like, or the original goal of Discover Weekly, how it involved kind of wanting to give people algorithmic recommendations for music they had never heard before. So the shift of the really highly prioritized algorithmic recommendations being basically stuff that's from your listening history.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know, like
it's all my listening history.
um, and it's like it seems like like a semantic difference or something, but it's like yeah, discover and made for you are completely different things. And in some ways, I kind of feel like the shift of that, the which one being prioritized, is like really interesting to me. And I think I have a moment in the book where I um like it seemed to kind of be sort of like a post TikTok kind of thing.
Yes.
Like it seemed like there's a really big
Hmm.
influence of the rise of TikTok, early pandemic era. Um, uh, one person that I talked to described the TikTok style feed as like the ultimate distillation of lean back listening. I thought that was super interesting. And um, yeah, it was just interesting, like charting these various moments that kind of shaped strategy in the company. And when I think of like the ways in which algorithmic recommendation changed the company, it seemed like there were like two big moments, like one being the success of Discover Weekly and the other being the influence of TikTok on kind of maybe how they shaped and presented these types of like automated recommendations.
Y- Yeah, I'm gonna say for Discover Weekly, again, I guess go having my music critic sort of hat on, I just sort of think back to like when Spotify, or at least in that context, it's sort of like what Spotify's offering is something akin to a pitchfork, akin to places that are giving you recommendations and recommending music to you, versus the shift of like, yeah, TikTok post pandemic, like probably keys a little clearer to me. If only because I'm also even thinking a little bit of like not AI as we're sort of talking about as we talk about AI now, but sort of AI maybe even like just sort of a few years ago where we just sort of thought of it sort of like speeding up and just sort of automating things and just having sort of the like and yeah, and it is like some of the stuff that I like covered a bit where it was like having some of these like not automated playlists, but epidemic sound kind of stuff, like of when that was sort of on playlist. And just yeah, this sort of like pivot that we're now sort of seeing where everything, yeah, is like for you, and the for you pitch does sort of like to me move from yeah, it does move from that recommendation that I guess it's a sort of a shift of audience, basically, going from people who are like interested in discovering new things and wanting to discover new things to just sort of like a more mass audience version of basically the exact same product, but it's just framed in a slightly more mass way. I mean, the same thing on YouTube. Like YouTube's recommendations like 10 years ago used to be so much more. expansive and like you could find more things just
Hmm.
looking at like similar videos on YouTube. Where now it's basically always the same stuff that you already have watched, stuff you already follow, and it keeps you in a very tight band. And I feel like Spotify is very, very similar to that. Or actually, maybe Spotify honestly predates some of that. I feel like YouTube lifted some of that from Spotify, honestly.
Well, I feel like it doesn't point beyond. I mean, the For You, I mean, A, it's solipsistic, but it also, it's like, what's the point of doing this? Is that if it's like rock sound discoveries, it's about me finding things that then, like, even implicitly, like ideologically, the idea is like, I would take that and do something with that discovery, like, put it in my collection, like, go see them. Well, the thing for me is like, it's the, I mean, you write about kind of like technologies as the self and like, like, or, almost like a medicalized understanding of musical consumption, and there's this sense that it's like this constantly filling a need that is just like yeah, it doesn't point beyond that listening experience. It doesn't ever leave Spotify. It doesn't even have the possibility of leaving Spotify. So one thing that clearly has gotten a lot of attention, and you might be sick of talking about it, is kind of ghost artists and fake artists, um, and the way that they are filling up pages and pages of these playlists that are being used in these kind of medicalized ways often. And like I have to say, like you, like I was going into this book being like, I still think this is a marginal thing that is just not that ultimately that important. And you like totally changed my mind. That it feels, yeah, it ended up feeling important. I've got all kinds of thoughts, but I was just maybe interested to hear a little bit more about like
Mhm.
how how you started thinking about this and how you think these artists, which ghosts, they're not ghosts, they're just like working musicians in New York, as you find out, a lot of them, or Sweden, um, like how they fit into the broader musical ecosystem of Spotify.
Mhm. Yeah. No, it's so interesting. Like in the book, I talk about how people have been writing about this for a really long time. In the Harper's excerpt, I specifically talked about like, this moment in 2017 when David pinpointed like this exact date when like all of these artists were removed from ambient chill and replaced with epidemic sound music. And I actually like I was literally like while I was working on the Harper's excerpt, I was like in my emails with David, like fact checking this stuff, like, because it really was like I mean, I went back in my emails and it was that after I wrote the first article about Spotify, like I had gotten an email from someone at an independent record label, being like, you should investigate this. And then like, it turns out you were already like deep in this research on it. So actually, David, maybe you should explain how the story like first came about since I've had to do it so many times.
I'll be brief. So the thing about the fake, like I guess quote unquote fake artists or the artists that were working with Epidemic Sound and sort of other similar firms is that like it was something that was covered in the music business press, but I don't think it was something that folks really knew that much about. So it had been covered in music business worldwide, and I was reading music business worldwide, saw it, and then I just kind of wanted to keep going a bit deeper as I sort of was reading these early reports. And I think that's when I went to like I honestly can't remember the names of these websites, and I don't even know if they even exist anymore because they were just sites where they basically like provide you sort of like breakdowns of Spotify playlists because a Spotify playlist you don't know when it's created, you don't know like there's a lot of like context that you just don't have that you even get on a web page that you don't get via an app that is just constantly sort of updating. So at least these were able to show like the playlist looked like this on this day, the playlist looked like this on this day. And then that's when I started looking deeper and which is sort of like, wait, some of these playlists, because I think maybe I have been hearing similar things, and also at that point I was very much like every day trying to dig as much as I could into this stuff because it was just so interesting. And also the smaller record labels that were interested in this stuff had really much higher stakes for them because they were sort of like had like a little boom period in the mid 2010s during the rise of streaming. Like they were one of the ones that were sort of benefiting from folks like listening to some of these like chill playlists, but they were actually like real like artists or artists from like smaller labels that were being filled up with them because this was not the priority of major label or even big independent labels at the time. And so once they started getting like encroached in, that's when it was sort of like the alarm bells went off for them because it was like, oh, this is like a very constant money, like also a very like easy money stream for like some of these smaller labels. Didn't have to print anything. There was no pressing, no vinyl, no CD. It was just like working with like a streaming platform, and that was basically it. It was very low lift. And then yeah, then once that stuff started getting swapped out with Epidemic Sound,
Hmm.
I was just sort of like, oh, that's strange. And that's once I started looking deeper, and then there's like all these profiles, and it's like these are all clearly not real musicians. Oh, again, what being presented is not someone's like real self. And so yeah, as I started digging deeper, I started writing more about it. And I think as I've sort of seen over the years, it's like a story that always takes people by surprise, I feel. Because it's sort of like I guess people listen to Spotify playlists and just assume everything they listen to is like legit. And I guess like once I sort of dove into the story, I just went to every Spotify playlist with like a certain level of skepticism. I guess it's sort of the way that people sort of view like AI images now or like certain things online. It's like, yeah, I guess I've kind of been attuned to that a little bit since 2018 because it's, oh, if Spotify playlists are just being filled with this stuff, and then that's when I started going deeper into like the labels of major labels playing this on the bigger playlist and sort of seeing that sort of a different version of sort of a similar dynamic.
Yeah, and if you can believe it, there's still so many media outlets that want to talk about this every day. I probably have like in my inbox, I probably have like 5 or 10 media requests that I haven't even answered yet. That are just people being like, "We're reporting on fake artists. We want to like, who are like really interested in this." And it is like, it's really, really interesting that it is like continued being such like a story that like the media is really interested in. I guess I think it maybe right now it's because people are seeing how many similarities there are between this conversation and like the conversation around generative AI content online, and this questioning of like, where does this material come from? What are the terms of its creation? What is the impact of it on quote unquote real artists? Like, I guess the similarity being that like both of them are ways in which like giant tech platforms attempt to reduce the cost of content or reduce royalties owed to working musicians by figuring out ways to supply like cheap anonymous content, um, and the ways in which both are can be sort of deceptive for listeners, because oftentimes, one of the big conversations happening right now about generative AI content on streaming services is like, will it be labeled? And should streaming services be required to label this content? And it's like, yeah, that's for me with the conversation with ghost artists. One of the, I think, biggest concerns is that this material is not labeled and it creates a lot of confusion for listeners, I think. Like there's a reason why for a decade people have been like, we need to talk about this because it's so mysterious. It's like, yeah, it shouldn't be mysterious. Like, people should know.
I also feel like what one of I mean, I feel like the intensity of people's reactions to it is actually really indicative of this like frankly like charming naivete on the part of many of like at a deep ideological level of American cultural consumers, right? There's this idea that it's like we don't like this is the closest thing to a real democracy people like believe in. That like it's like the artists who get the most plays or the movies that have the most ticket sales are like being voted on to number one by the American people. And there's something like that's like in a consumer society, that's like art, like what Thomas Jefferson would have wanted. And like the idea that it's um not fair, the idea that they're these like fake artists, that they're not real people, that they're being like orchestrated by companies, that Spotify is doing this to reduce the overall payout rates, like all of that just like suggests, I feel like some it's like it suggests like the crookedness of the entire system in a way that like boils it all down to like its purest
Mhm.
distillation.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the way it kind of punctures that like myth of like this is a meritocrat, a data-driven meritocracy, and you can just point to this program and say, no, it's not. Like, there are Which is it's interesting because just like the knowledge of the major labels like immense influence over these platforms like should already be enough proof that this is not a meritocratic uh system. But in some ways
A
it
knowledge of music history writ large.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. But yeah, like it seems like this has been convincing for some people, which is really interesting. I also will say, like, something that's been coming up more often in more recent conversations, because as more journalists have been reporting on this, Spotify has been issuing statements to some of these outlets, and a statement that they have been providing is that this content only amounts to or accounts for a small percentage of total streams on their service. And I think that it's super interesting to unpack that a little bit because, yes, like
yeah.
the number of hours that people spend listening to PFC content might be a small percentage of total listening. But
Can you
I think
just tell our listeners what PFC means really quick?
oh yeah, perfect fit content. It's the term that Spotify uses internally to describe music from this specific group of licensors um, who provide, they describe it internally as music commissioned to fit a specific mood or playlist with improved margins. That's like an official internal definition. Um, yeah, chef's kiss. And they'll say it's a small percentage of total listening, but something that is really interesting, like that I've been a link that I've been sending to people who've been asking me about this is this story from Music Business Worldwide. Shout out to Music Business Worldwide.
God's
Couldn't
work. God's
couldn't
work.
couldn't couldn't have written the book without you. It's cited like all throughout the end notes, and just actually like so many of the writers who do this kind of like daily grind sort of music business reporting writing this book gave me like a renewed like appreciation for. But there's this Music Business Worldwide article from last year that points out that in 2023, Taylor Swift's total stream share on on-demand audio accounted for less, like, or just under 2% of total stream share, and that the entire classical genre was under 1% of total stream share, and that the entire genre of jazz was under 1% of total stream share. And I think that it kind of puts things in perspective when you're saying, well, this material is a small percentage of total stream share. Like even if it's 1 or 2% of total stream share, that's still a lot in comparison to it just talking about things in terms of total percentage of total stream share just sort of warps our idea of what is impactful or what is consequential. And even if it is a small percentage of total stream share, like it's not a small deal to artists who make jazz and classical music and ambient music and lo-fi hip hop music who have experienced firsthand either being replaced on these playlists or who have struggled to connect with audiences in a meaningful way. I mean, one of the most interesting parts of writing this book was interviewing people who make lo-fi hip hop beats about the struggle to connect meaningfully with audiences in the era of streaming and YouTube, and it's super super interesting.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that blew my mind about the way you discuss this, and the thing that really I've been just like trying to think through, and I'd love to hear your guys' take on this, is I mean, in the very beginning of the book, you talk about this like 2008, 2009 moment when actually the major labels are crashing and indie records are doing pretty well. And you say like, well, someone needed a solution, but like the fact that the same blanket solution got put on everyone has had disastrous implications in many ways for um, hard to say because it's so opaque. Maybe not all independent music scenes, but certainly like big major. There's a number of major independent music scenes that this kind of like a global solution has been disastrous for, and it's made me really think about the ways in which like what happens to some music impacts what happens to other kinds of music. That like music is this funny thing, and it like and how it's commodified and how it functions within capitalism can operate in all kinds of different ways, maybe because of some of that looseness of commodification. Like if you start like if something happens to it over here, it ends up somehow impacting it back over there. And in that thinking about it that way, it made for the first time realize that like taking this music and creating this incredibly devalued, incredibly low payout music. Even if it is like you're saying, I mean, 2% is a whole lot of streams, 3% is a whole lot of streams, but even if it's a small percentage, it does something important to the rest of the music on the platform. It drops the floor lower. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of like um when like women's labor
Mhm.
was completely pulled out of the marketplace in like industrialization, so that like in fact it's two people working to make a house, but like the people who like running factories could just pay enough for just pay one person because someone else is working for nearly free. That there's this like by pulling value out of a chunk of the market, it shifts everything in that entire market towards that direction. And then having and it feels like maybe that's part of the reason why they spend so much time and energy pushing at the margins, because it's not that it's just 1%, 2%, that why does it matter? It's because anything that happens to any kind of music on this platform inevitably impacts all the rest of the music on the
Mhm.
platform.
Yeah, kind of. It also, I mean, I don't know if this is too much of a jump, but it reminds me of like the idea of Daniel Ek saying that now when it comes to making music, the cost of content is close to zero. It's like, if you're normalizing the idea that the cost of making music now can be close to zero, that's a dangerous idea to normalize for lots of reasons. But if it shifts like the way in which a consumer thinks about the value of music, like that has impacts on everyone in a landscape where like all of these artists are expected to monetize their work using the same tools.
I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but I do just feel like this does go hand in hand with sort of the increased value put on live performances that we saw like after the financial crisis, and even more so. I guess we're kind of in like the still
Mm-hmm.
post-COVID destabilization period of live music, where it's like it was gone, things were very bad, then it came back, and things were like maybe too hot, and now things are like in this weird kind of new zone, like this weird kind of new zone. But
Yeah.
to go just sort of pull it back to the previous sort of point, it's like this is happening as these entire other parts of like the selling of music is being entirely destabilized. So as that's getting destabilized, there's just like more and more pressure on the live side. And I do think that is like something that is sort of like a parallel story. And I guess maybe that's just another book that I'll be excited to read one day, just of like live since the financial crisis, because like it has just had to take on so much weight in lieu of what's happened to the record part of the music industry. And because of that, even as we see like labels themselves do like sort of recover, it is still in a world where like musicians are struggling ever more. So I do think that's like something that like I guess yeah, it's maybe a whole nother book, honestly, but it is something that I do think about a lot, or like it's something I've thought a lot more about as I haven't been covering and following this stuff quite as much over the last like I guess a year, almost a year and a half, because I engage with music much more at this point, kind of
Yeah.
like going to stuff. And because I feel like I don't listen to quite as much like new music because it just all kind of feels a bit of a blur. I also feel like I see the economics of the strain of the economics of live music much more so than I do on the sort of streaming side, which I don't think was always the case. I don't think that those things were quite as stark odds as they are in 2025 versus maybe like 30 or 40 years ago if you were a music fan or consumer.
What do you mean?
I mean, like, so if I was interested in music in 1985 and I was deciding between buying a record and going to a concert, I don't think I would be feeling quite the same level of like sort of day-to-day sort of discrepancy where it's like I don't know how much a concert cost in the 80s, but I'm sure it was not quite so far as like a regular concert ticket versus now where you have streaming, it's like I actually pay like I guess like nothing because I just bear ads every day. So I don't pay
Yeah.
anything. But if I want to go to a show, if I want to go to a show that is not like a small show, that's like probably 40, 50, 60, $70. If I want to buy a drink, that's like maybe like $15. And like all of a sudden, that's like $100 experience to go see music. That's as much as I'm going to pay for the entire year of streaming for one live show. Which I don't think that's what I sort of meant about the discrepancy is that like to be a regular engager of live music feels like such a much more expensive proposition than it was at one point, and also to me sort of like creates this sort of increased dissonance between those two parts of the industry.
I do think there also is this dynamic where, music fans, like real, like people who really care about music are like, often being told, well, the artists you love don't make anything from streaming, so it's up to you to buy tickets to shows and buy their merch and like, support artists directly, and the sort of like shift to the personal responsibility of thinking about your like ethical consumerism in the music business and how much you spend on shows compared with how much you spend on digital music or recorded music. Like, yeah, is this like a thing that independent music fans were sort of tasked with in decades
Yeah.
past? I'm not sure.
No, I mean in this sense of like having to do ethical consumption. It's like, yeah,
Like whatever that means.
right. Before we move on from the ghost
Hmm.
artists, I have like a very specific question that
Hmm.
like I get to ask right now.
Hmm.
Why do they keep making new ones?
Oh.
Like, why is I was poking around like on Spotify, and like they're all the artists on like the chill patio warm vibes, which is like what I'm imagining from the winter in Maine. uh, they're all from like they all have 5 releases, and they're all the releases are from 2024. And it's like, where did like why it isn't 2022 chill jazz is the same, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. I think that maybe part of it has to do with just sort of like the nature of um how things enter the systems of curation and recommendation, like and
Mm-hmm.
uh you know this constant need for like new content to like throw into the recommendation machine and see like what takes off and what sticks, like the endless hunger for like content that is highly reactive or whatever, like I think I
Mm-hmm.
and part of it is that, or like I think it also could just be, the desire to sort of keep up the appearance that these are playlists that like have thought being put into them. Like, yeah, like our editors refresh our playlists constantly with like the freshest new stuff. So if you're a fan, like if there's someone whose listening behavior is built around going to like what's a low what's like a playlist you just mentioned that you were
Oh,
listening to,
I mean, yeah, just
or
like
like checking
chill
out.
and then like a set of warm place signifiers was what I was
Yeah,
listening to.
like Ibiza chill is one of them, right? Like you're like, okay, yeah, I live in Maine and I like to listen to Ibiza chill every day and pretend that I don't live in Maine, and that it's not cold and rainy or whatever. Like if you're someone whose like listening habit is built around Ibiza chill, if Ibiza chill sounds exactly the same every day, you're probably going to get sick of it. And what they want to do is like, retain you as a person who finds the Ibiza chill playlists to be interesting and valuable. So they want to like change up what's on Ibiza chill every once in a while with fresh new tracks out of the content mill.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It struck me as this funny thing where it's like they've changed all of the parts on the inside, but like they have to keep the outside looking like it's normal music still. Like you're not using this to learn about like the hot new artist, but like it still needs to look that way, or else it the whole thing kind of falls apart maybe.
Hmm. Yeah, I also think that like, the more of this content that they have, like the more chance there is to sort of expand the listenership of
Yeah,
it.
right, that makes sense. So as we kind of move towards the end of this conversation, sadly, in Money for Nothing tradition of like getting a little bit heady with it at the end of an episode, I mean, some of the most interesting parts of the book for me, where we talk about the ways in which you have all this kind of hyper focused genre creation and playlist algorithmic and or editorial, or that wonderful word that means both. Um, what's that word again?
Algotorial, such
Algotorial.
nonsense.
Ugh, algatorial. Ugh, first time I've said it out loud. Uh,
Lucky you.
Yeah, very lucky. Sitting in meetings about stuff like that. Soul crushing, soul crushing.
Wow. First time you said algotorial out loud. Cool flex.
but but so you have all these new kind of listener nodules. We're post genre. We're no longer post race, but we're definitely post genre in this country. And like the that this is increasingly the way that people are engaging with music, even if like none of this actually works, like there is no sauce in the magic sauce. There's enough power behind Spotify that people are
Oh man, yeah.
Ipsum users or Lorem users
Lorem Ipsum. Oh my God,
Pollen,
so
yeah,
cool.
pollen. Hay
Yes.
fever.
or pollen listeners or like whatever micro,
Hmm.
yeah, all these like right, but like this is increasingly the way that people, the same way maybe that people were classic rock listeners or college radio
I love
listeners,
Bach.
that there are these new,
Oh, you said classic rock. I thought you said Bach. I was like, I love listening to Bach. Okay, sorry, continue.
no, Bach is sick. I'm a period instrument Bach guy. If you're using 20th century instruments, I'm not interested. I literally on Spotify can't find it, so I have to like I Spotify like Bach and then consort because the bands that play Bach on period instruments are all called like something consort. That's right.
Sorry.
That's two in the weeds about my own. No, but so there are all these different like this is the way that people are engaging. Huge chunks of people are engaging with music, and like you go in this like part where you go to some like a bunch of like Spotify shows, and you meet these kids who are like, yeah, I just like it's like hip hop, but it like with pleasant beats over the top, and I guess like what is all of this like specific Spotify culture? Like it's not music, it's Spotify music. Like what do you think that's done or is doing to listeners? Like to people who care enough about music to go to a show in Bushwick, but they care about like the playlist of it. Like what what do you think
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
doing?
it's super interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I'm working on like sort of teasing out some of the post-genre ideas into some new writing. But yeah, it's so interesting because okay, like this kind of like idea that streaming has helped usher in a post-genre era is hilarious to me in a lot of ways. Like if you think about the reasons why people historically have felt really limited by genre or have disliked genre, it's because of the ways that like marketing has arbitrarily or like unfairly boxed listeners and musicians into certain categories for the purposes of marketing, right? Or at least that's part of it. And if you look at like what we have now, it's like it's not it's not like that has been diminished. It's just like these streaming services come up with all of these different like new words to describe music and new ways to create new audience segments in smaller and smaller and smaller detail. And a lot of the stuff that is like pitched as kind of like post genre, like Lorem or Pollen, it's like these are branding exercises that both sort of like come from looking at user data patterns. I mean, like, okay, there clearly seems to be a certain types of user who is over here, who is listening to music in this way. How can we like group them all together aesthetically in order to, market Spotify to
Yeah.
them? Or, it's not even like how can not even only like how can we fine tune this market segment so that we can sell it to advertisers. It's like how can we fine tune this market segment so that we can sell ourselves to them and sell our own value to them. And that's what I think of when I think of like the pollen and lorem, but also like all these micro genres. It was so interesting seeing like the way in which uh really specific micro genres would pop up in Spotify's advertising materials on the Spotify for Artists side. Like, there's literally Spotify for Artists. Sorry, there's the Spotify advertising materials where they're talking about marketing to Gen Z, and they were talking about like, marketing to listeners of weirdcore or something, like these really specific micro genres. And to me, it just sort of really drove home how like so much of this project of kind of like saying that we're in a post-genre landscape or whatever is really just like a new way of thinking about putting people into um, audience segments so that they can be targeted in new ways. I don't know.
But then they listen to them, right? Like at least some people then end up having these new engagements, new kinds of engagements with like vibes that are way more specific than like any vibe would have like could have like pre Pinterest.
Hmm. Yeah. I think, for me, there's a quote in the book where I'm talking about hyperpop, and there's this quote from the producer, Umaru, where he just says, yeah, the influence of the hyperpop playlist on the hyperpop scene was that it contributed to helping make it the path of least resistance, just become a fan of a sound instead of actually engaging with and learning about the artists that were on that playlist and like the scenes that they came from and the culture around it. And it just made it really easy to just become a fan of this one specific aesthetic. And in a lot of ways, I feel like, that to me, that kind of like neatly summed up sort of the impacts of playlistification on like smaller and more niche scenes, I guess. Journalists have always done this, like taken a group of artists and grouped them together and like tried to say there's a trend here or something. But oftentimes, like, that would involve going and talking to people and interviewing them and trying to kind of like do a scene
Yeah.
report or
Oh, damn,
something,
sorry. You're
not
right.
just saying if music sounds like this, like purely based on vibes, like this, it deserves this label or something. And
Sorry, it's just the micro genre thing does sort of it is always like a little funny to me because I guess yeah, to what Liz is saying is that like genre is something that artists have wrestled with for like a long time. And I do think one of the things I guess I thought about some of the micro genres from a slightly different point of view because I just been in
Hmm.
such a like an electronic music world and listening to mixes where things are slightly to me slightly more vibey and slightly more like, oh, I'm listening to this one radio station or I'm listening to this one like NTS or and there ends up sort of being like whole not quite because it's not because it ends up being somewhat micro genres where people are just following one DJ or one sort of set of DJs, but it's not like they're listening to a specific radio station that's that is like specific to a specific place, but it's like a digital one. And it's just so in that sense, I'm kind of like, oh, like that is again just kind of like just a small sort of subgenre. But I guess I'll go back to what I started saying about live music earlier, where it's like because again, people aren't even going to a lot of spaces and going to a lot of shows in quite the same way that it does just sort of still to me feel like a little bit thinner than things were a bit previously. Or maybe it's just different. I think that's also the other thing is that like maybe it's just a bit different and it's
Hmm.
just sort of a different way of how contemporary music culture is sort of being experienced is from people going to shows where it's very much all aesthetic based and sort of the like culture kind of comes second from the aesthetic. Sorry, it took a while to sort of get there. But I guess
Yeah.
in my head, I'm just thinking of all the parties I've walked by in Bushwick the last few years that just feel like such grab bags of other things. But it's clearly as much of a thing to those people as the thing that was there 10 years or 20 years prior. But it also is different because people aren't selling records. People aren't actually buying music and like people are spending a lot more on a lot of those shows and a lot of those experiences than people were a number of years ago. So I guess that just sort of goes back to what I was sort of saying earlier, just about
Mhm.
like that sort of split between where dollars are actually sort of going, where it's like, oh, there's a lot more knowledge of like the spaces and like how much people are paying for those versus like, oh, the label or the record because like you aren't buying those or you aren't really consuming those quite in the same way.
Yeah. And like the A to B of it can happen much more quick, which is what you write about, Liz. That like the sense of there can be a real there. And then once you have anything that sounds vaguely like it, it can all be slotted in. And it's much, maybe people don't have necessarily that sense of listening habits that point outside of Spotify. Like when you were describing that, I was thinking about like the first wave of British punk music, where like there's the hilarious thing where like there aren't enough punk bands. There's like two, right? There's the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and maybe the Damned, and like those are all like punk bands. But then there's like a whole bunch of like there's no more yet.
There's the slits and the raincoats. Thank you.
A
Yes.
year later, right?
Actually, I don't know the timeline well enough. When I think of like the beginnings of punk, those are
No,
the
no,
bands that I think of.
no. They're totally are, and like, but like, there's the first, like, they're all like, there's many bands, but like, my understanding is like 75. Like, there's like three bands, and the Clash aren't really even a punk band. There's kind of just the Sex Pistols as a marketing fraud. But like they shove in all these other funny bands like further down. Like the Stranglers are also like they're not a punk band. They're like a very strange band. But like
I
oh no
I
just
mean
the
you
sense of
oh
like being
sorry.
able to
Yeah.
that this happened, but then more people get to the sound. But it's that now it can happen so quickly, and that process of commodification, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, but is it that quickly? Because I mean, you're also describing to me indie sleaze and the dare, where it's like the dare and indie sleaze is like another thing where it's like a term in like a genre or an aesthetic in search of any art to be found around it. So when people talk about like the dare at one point, it was just like, oh well, is this like a progenitor or like or more come of it? And it's like, no, this is a thing that was basically kind of a very late generation like media creation in that kind of way. And also, I only asked about the speed because, yeah, it's like 70, like 75 and 76. It's like the story of like the Sex Pistols, for instance, like that happened fairly fast. It wasn't like that was like a 10-year project. That was only like only a handful of months. They moved very quickly throughout that entire thing.
Guys, there's an endless amount of things to talk about from this. Like, I swear that like there's like one amazing observation per page, which means that I've got a list of 240 amazing observations. So we could sit here and talk about this all day, but I think we have to say thank you to Liz and to David. Thanks so much for coming on the pod. Thank you for both of you for all the work that you've done in figuring out um, what's happening to all of us.
Thank you. Wait, can we just like on the record have David tell us how he's been doing? The fans want to know.
Uh,
What's
That's
going
true. The
on with
fans do
David
want to know, David.
Turner
okay,
post penny fractions?
I'll be very quick because I don't know if I've actually said what I did when I why I left the newsletter. Maybe I have recorded that. I actually don't
I
know.
just I
That's
have
the
the
right
most
place to tell someone.
like the most vivid memory of the night David told me he was shutting down penny fractions. It sticks in my
Was it?
mind. I wrote about it in my diary.
Wait, hold on. Was that at Do or Die?
Yeah.
Yes, no, it was very clear. Yeah, no, so yeah, I can be very quick about this. So basically, I was laid off from SoundCloud in May of 2023, which was like something I was kind of expecting to happen at some point once I started working there in 2019. It just took like two rounds of layoff instead of one. And so because of that, like I knew I wasn't going to work in music. I knew I didn't want to work in tech or like journalism. I was like, I've done this for my 20s. I'm good. I'm out of here. Peace. And then I basically spent the summer just applying to jobs for working for New York City or working for a union, which I think if you read Penny Fragments, you would know that I had a very deep interest in organized labor. That comes from my background as a music journalist and when I was in like a unionized shop. And so I wanted just to do that with my career. And then by luck and chance, I got a job in the city for the New York City's Office of Labor Relations, which I will not describe because it's very boring. I need to get back to work because I messed up a Excel sheet, so I also need to finish that like within the next hour. But once I got that job, I like within the first like 2 days of sitting at my computer, I was like, oh well, I don't need to do this. I'm good. And like basically knew I wasn't gonna keep doing my newsletter because I just like knew that this job and like the amount of thoughts I was having, I think it was the thing that one of the things I liked about SoundCloud, one of the reasons I really liked talking with Liz and Sam while like working on my newsletter and also working at SoundCloud was like there's so much to think about and so much in this space per what Sam was just saying about Liz's book. And so when I got to the city job, I was just like, there's this whole new world out here of New York City, like a bureaucrat in New York City that I can get to learn and understand. And it's like this is like well over 100 years of history that I can get to kind of engage with. And I was like, I have to do that. I have to do that as much as I possibly can. And so once I did that, I like realized within a few days, like my newsletter's done. That's why it ended a bit abruptly, and I kind of regret that a bit. I wish I like teased out a few more thoughts before I just kind of like exited. But once I let go by the end of December 2023, I was like, all good. Because I go to work and I'm just like, oh, there's so much stuff that I want to kind of do and think about. Which I guess to wrap it real quick, where I've been at least recently is I've been really excited about like a mayoral campaign. Sorry, I will make a quick politics thing. Yeah, so I'm on Donnie as a mayoral candidate in New York City, and I just been super invested in that race. And part of the reason I think to tie it back to some of the stuff in my own newsletter is my newsletter came after Trump's election in 2016. It's like I started in 2017, but I do think of it very much politically within that post-Trump era. and I think about my newsletter in the context of the Biden admin, because we have a little bit of being able to look back, of following the stuff that was happening with regulation in the UK, following all the different ways that different countries, like getting to write a paper for the country of France about music streaming, like about music streaming catalogs. Like there was a very clear in the first part of this decade, like sort of interest in trying to better understand the music industry and how it's changed so rapidly, or in some ways maybe not so rapidly as you sort of could see in that and looking at like song catalog purchases. But like there were just a lot of renewed interest and like care and a lot of organizing being done around this stuff by like UMA, by other folks. And so like I was just very like enthralled in that. And I think that once I sort of stepped out of that and then went back to kind of the more political
Mm.
organizing work that I
Well,
had also been doing since 2018, it kind of made me, one, yeah, I definitely miss covering this stuff and following all these things, but I also get to spend a lot of my time sort of thinking about stuff that to me maybe a little bit more immediately closer to home because again, it's like what my day job is now. It's like I work for the city, so I care deeply about the trajectory and sort of like in the future of it.
Are you going to start a blog called Filed in Triplicate?
Never. No, I like no. That's one of the things I like. That's also another thing that I'll just say, and it's my last point because this is personal to me. It's like once I got done with my newsletter, like I've still done some writing. Like I kind of still want to write some more about stuff as it comes to me. But I did feel a very like good sense of closure about doing what I did for those, I guess, 6 or so years of like writing kind of about my own day job and writing about a lot of things that were just so immediately close to me. And I kind of felt good like closing that off of like this was sort of a moment. It's really cool. I obviously met so many great people and continue to meet great people through the work that I was able to do. But I was just sort of like, yeah, I think it was a cool like run, but I'm not sure I wanted to keep sort of like chronicling that so much like every day.
well, it was a, yeah, like Penny Fractions was an incredible contribution. I was grateful to be able to go through some of the archives while working on the book. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's sort of, there's something that just like inherently really makes sense about spending like all this time, like deeply immersed in the music business and then it ending up with like pointing you towards wanting to like work for the city and help support socialist local socialist candidates. It's like it makes a lot of sense to me in some ways, and like especially when you think about like what the true problems at the root of the way artists and creative labor is devalued in our society. It's like, oh yeah, like the things that would actually fix this, the things that would fix problems for a lot of working class people, you know?
Yeah, and my last one, I mean, I guess this is why when I was at SoundCloud, I really enjoyed the work that I got to do around user-centric streaming and trying to sort of promote that and propagandize that a bit. Even if I was never like, oh, this is the end all be all, this is the final solution to anything, it was just cool to have the opportunity to try to like move that conversation and also like try to in some ways get and I guess I could probably speak on this maybe another day, but like trying to get a thing like SoundCloud to engage with some of the academics and some of the researchers and stuff that were interested in this stuff. Because for them, like getting access to this data, being able to do research sort of projects on different models was like a I mean, as Liz, as you know, like trying to get information from a company like Spotify is basically impossible. They do not want to give you anything actually real about what's going on. And I felt like while I was at SoundCloud, at least like there was like a very like sort of weird, again, maybe like again Biden-esque era where I was like, oh yeah, maybe we should be heeding a little bit more attention to these sort of critics and these people on the outside, or maybe on the inside, speaking to the folks on the outside around some of the issues that like a lot of folks are sort of seeing in the space.
Well, David, Liz, either of you ever want to come back on Money for Nothing, you're more than welcome. David, I think that I just feel in my gut that there will be another big score that you have to come back in out of the cold for. Thank you guys both so much. And good luck with all of your
Yes.
media invites, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is
Super fun.
yeah, I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation with you guys.